Welcome back, everyone. Get ready, because today we're diving deep into something pretty heavy.
Yeah, this one's a big one.
It is, but it's also super important in today's world. We're going to try to figure out how something like tariffs, something that seems kind of ordinary,
Right.
could lead to, and I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, global thermonuclear tension. Like,
Mm.
what?
Yeah, it's a long way down.
Seriously, at first glance, it does sound a little far-fetched, right?
Uh-huh.
But then when you really look at the source material you gave us,
Yeah.
it kind of paints a picture that's, well, pretty wild, to say the least.
Wild and unfortunately possible.
Okay, so for our listener out there, let's break this whole thing down, starting with the basics. Tariffs. Can you explain what tariffs are in a way that, even if someone's never taken Econ 101, they could still understand?
Absolutely. Think of it this way. Tariffs are like a border tax a country puts on stuff coming in from other places.
Okay, so like a tax on imports.
Exactly. The idea is to make those foreign goods pricier so people are more likely to buy stuff made locally.
Right, right. So it's kind of like giving local businesses a boost.
You got it. In theory, at
That
least.
makes sense. It's like a way to protect local industries, right?
Right.
But then what happens when every country starts doing this? Doesn't that kind of like spiral into a trade war?
Precisely. And the source material we're looking at uses a prime example. The U.S.-China trade war. During the Trump years,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
it all started with tariffs on things like steel and aluminum, but it blew up quickly. Both sides ended up putting tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods.
Wow.
And that's when it goes beyond just simple economics.
Yeah, totally. Instead of kids fighting over toys, it's like entire nations going head to head with the global economy hanging in the balance.
Yeah, exactly.
Those stakes are like unbelievably high, right?
Yeah, and it goes beyond just economics. These trade wars can totally reshape alliances on a global scale.
I see what you mean.
Countries need to find new partners, for economic support, sometimes even military support. Gets messy fast.
That makes total sense. And speaking of alliances, one of the sources brought up Iran, like their nuclear ambitions, and how all the U.S. sanctions and tariffs might have actually pushed them closer to, like, Russia and China.
It's a big
Yeah, it seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. You'd think isolating a country economically would weaken them. But sometimes it has the opposite effect.
Huh.
In this case, it seems to have pushed Iran towards Russia and China for support, maybe even strengthening those relationships.
So instead of weakening Iran, it might have actually empowered them.
That's a key takeaway from the source material, for sure. And this brings us to something I think is really relevant to our whole deep dive today.
Okay, what's that?
This whole dynamic, where countries are basically forced to pick sides,
Right.
economically and politically,
Yeah.
feels a little too familiar, historically speaking.
You're talking about World War I, right?
Exactly. One of the sources drew a parallel to that time. You know how economic rivalries and all those shifting alliances played a big part in that whole thing. Yeah, for sure.
And that parallel, we can't ignore it. When trade falls apart, trust erodes, alliances shift, miscalculations happen, things escalate.
Right.
And we live in a world with nuclear-armed states, so the potential consequences are way more serious now.
Oh, for sure. It's a whole different ballgame. So trade wars can create these opposing groups, right? Fueled by mistrust. But how does that actually translate into like increased global tension, especially to the point we're talking about potential nuclear conflict?
Think about it this way. When countries are fighting an economic battle, they start looking at each other with suspicion. Distrust creates a super volatile environment, A tiny incident could get blown out of proportion, trigger something much bigger.
It's like everyone's on edge waiting for the smallest thing to set things off.
Yeah, exactly. And this is all made even more complicated by nationalism, which these trade wars often fuel.
Right.
The source material made a big point about how this surge in nationalism makes diplomacy even harder.
I get it. If your country is in the middle of some economic feud,
It's way easier to see the other side as the enemy, even if things aren't really that black and white.
totally. And that can snowball into all sorts of problems.
Yeah,
From, simple misunderstandings to straight up hostility.
for sure. So we've got these potential power blocks, fueled by distrust, nationalism on the rise. I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, or should I say the thermonuclear elephant in the room.
What?
How does all of this connect to the possibility of, well, nuclear war?
It's not about one specific event leading to, a nuclear exchange. It's more about the big picture, the overall environment, all this distrust and hostility that these trade wars can create.
Right.
It's a situation where Any little mistake, any miscalculation could escalate super fast,
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
and the consequences would be catastrophic.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, and it's definitely unsettling. But it's still hard to imagine countries actually, like, stumbling into nuclear war. There are systems in place, right?
Hmm.
Safeguards to prevent that.
There are safeguards, yeah.
Yeah.
But they rely on things like clear communication,
Uh-huh.
rational decision-making, a basic level of trust between nations. And like we've been talking about, trade wars can really damage all of that.
So even if no one actually wants a nuclear war,
Right.
the risk of it happening still goes way up when you have all this tension and lack of trust simmering under the surface.
Exactly. It's not about intent. It's about the potential for things to go wrong in a world that's becoming more and more volatile and unpredictable.
So are we just doomed then? Is there anything we can do to, like, de-escalate things, or are we just waiting for the metaphorical mushroom cloud? Because that's not exactly how I want to start my
But
day.
no, don't despair just yet. The good news is there are alternatives to these tariff wars that everyone seems to love these days.
Okay, good. I'm all ears. What are some of those alternatives?
Well, one of the sources emphasized diplomatic negotiations as a key solution. It might seem obvious, but instead of slapping tariffs on each other, maybe countries could, actually talk and try to work things out.
Revolutionary, I know. But seriously, why does it seem like everyone always forgets about diplomacy?
It's a good question. I think there are a lot of reasons. But setting those aside, diplomacy is crucial. It's about finding common ground, building trust, and resolving stuff peacefully.
Right.
And it's not just limited to two countries talking to each other either. Multilateral trade agreements are important too.
Multilateral meaning involving multiple countries.
Exactly. These agreements can help make things fairer for everyone involved in international trade. Less temptation to resort to things like tariffs.
So it's like instead of every country just looking out for themselves, they're working together to set some rules that benefit everyone in the long run.
That's the idea. Of course, these agreements can be super complicated and take forever to negotiate, but they have the potential to be really powerful tools for cooperation and stability globally.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got diplomacy and multilateral agreements. Anything else in the source material?
One more thing. Targeted sanctions. Maybe a more effective way to deal with specific problems without starting a huge trade war.
Ah, so instead of punishing an entire country with tariffs,
Right.
you focus on specific people or industries that are doing something bad.
Exactly. Like a surgical strike instead of just carpet bombing everything.
Gotcha. So we've got some potential solutions, but let's be real. These are huge issues, no easy answers. And the stakes are incredibly high, like we've seen. It feels like this possibility of conflict is always looming in the background.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a question for our listener, something to think about.
Okay, what is it?
We started with tariffs, and now we're talking about nuclear war. It might seem like a huge jump, but the sources you gave me suggest it's a possibility we need to consider. And it all comes down to choices. If tariffs are a tool, what happens when people use that tool recklessly?
Right.
What responsibility do countries have to think about how their economic policies affect global security?
Wow, that's a big question. Honestly, I don't have a simple answer for that.
Me neither.
But I think that's kind of the point of these deep dives, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's about encouraging our listener to think critically about these huge, complex issues, to consider all the different sides and start asking the tough questions.
Exactly. So, to our listener out there, we've explored this whole potential chain reaction. Tariffs to trade wars, global tension, and yeah, we even touched on the unthinkable nuclear conflict. We've talked about the risks, the history, and the alternatives. Now it's up to you to dig deeper into the source material, come to your own conclusions, and figure out where you stand on this whole thing. It's a big deal.
It is.
The future of global stability might just depend on it.
Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.
And maybe keep that lead-lined hat handy just in case.
You never know. Let's try to paint a picture for our listener, okay?
Yeah.
Imagine two countries, both with nuclear weapons. They're already kind of at odds because of, a trade war.
Okay.
Tensions are running high. There's not a lot of trust. Everyone's on edge,
Yeah, it's like a powder keg, just waiting for that spark.
Exactly. Now, throw in something like a military exercise that gets misinterpreted,
Oh, wow.
or a cyber attack nobody knows where it came from, or even just like a false alarm from a missile detection system.
Right.
In this kind of climate, all this distrust, all this tension, these incidents can get out of control really, really quickly.
Yeah. for sure.
What might have been a minor diplomatic hiccup in a more stable world could suddenly become like a flashpoint for something way more serious.
That's a scary thought. But countries don't just accidentally, like, stumble into nuclear war, do they? I mean, there are systems in place, right? Safeguards to prevent that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are safeguards,
Right.
but they rely on clear communication, rational decision-making, a baseline of trust between nations. And as we've been discussing, trade wars can really erode all of those things.
Right, right. So you're saying that even if no one actually wants a nuclear war,
Uh-huh.
the risk of it happening still goes way up when you have all this tension and lack of trust, like poisoning the well, so to speak.
Precisely. It's not necessarily about intent. It's about the potential for miscalculation and escalation in a world that's becoming increasingly volatile and unpredictable.
Okay, yeah. So if trade wars can create this kind of like perfect storm for potential conflict, are there any historical examples, like specific ones that illustrate how dangerous this dynamic can actually be?
Well, one example that comes to mind is the period leading up to World War I. The sources you provided highlighted how economic rivalries and, shifting alliances really set the stage for that whole conflict.
Right, I remember reading about that. But how does that relate to the threat of nuclear war? World War I didn't involve nuclear weapons.
True, but it shows how quickly economic competition can turn into political and military conflict.
Ah,
And in today's world, where several countries have nuclear weapons, the potential consequences of a conflict like that are, well, exponentially greater.
yeah, that's a sobering thought. It seems like history has a lot to teach us about, the dangers of unchecked economic nationalism and the importance of international cooperation.
Absolutely. And it's not just about learning from the past, it's also about understanding the psychological factors that can contribute to conflict escalation.
Okay, what do you mean by psychological factors?
Well, one of the sources went into this concept of cognitive biases and how they can really influence decision-making,
Okay.
especially in high-stress situations.
Cognitive biases. Can you explain that a bit more for our listener?
Sure. Cognitive biases are basically mental shortcuts our brains use to process information quickly.
Okay.
They can be helpful in a lot of situations, but they can also lead to, errors in judgment,
Right.
particularly when we're dealing with complex and emotionally charged issues like international relations.
So how do these cognitive biases play into the dynamics of trade wars and potential conflict?
Well, one example is confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah, it's the tendency to look for information that confirms what we already believe
Oh,
and ignore or downplay evidence that contradicts it.
right, right.
So, if a country already sees another country as a rival economically, confirmation bias might lead them to interpret any action by that rival as hostile,
Okay.
even if it's not intended that way.
So it's like they're looking for reasons to be suspicious.
Exactly. And this can create like a self-fulfilling prophecy
Hmm.
where actions taken to protect oneself from a perceived threat actually end up escalating the situation.
It's like this dangerous feedback loop, right? Where distrust breeds more distrust.
Precisely. And another cognitive bias that can be a factor is groupthink,
Groupthink. Okay.
which is the tendency for groups to make decisions that are more extreme than any individual member would make on their own.
Interesting.
So in a trade war, groupthink might push a country's leaders to adopt, more aggressive policies than they would if they were thinking about it objectively.
Right, right.
And this is especially risky when you have a group of people who feel pressure to look strong and decisive
Yeah, I can see that.
in the face of a perceived threat.
So it seems like these cognitive biases can really amplify the risks of trade wars
Absolutely.
and make it harder to find peaceful solutions.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these biases
Yeah.
and try to mitigate their influence on decision-making.
Okay, so if we're talking about mitigating risks and finding peaceful solutions, are there any like specific strategies or approaches that could help de-escalate these potentially dangerous situations?
Well, the sources you gave me highlighted a few alternatives to that tit-for-tat approach that we see a lot with trade wars.
Okay.
Diplomacy, as we've talked about, is crucial. It's about open communication, building trust, and finding common ground.
It sounds simple enough, but I imagine it's really hard to do in practice, when you have national pride and economic interests at stake.
Oh, absolutely. Diplomacy takes patience, persistence, a willingness to compromise, but it's essential if we want to avoid these kinds of destructive conflicts that, have been happening for centuries.
So beyond diplomacy, what other options are there?
One source suggested that multilateral trade agreements could play a big role in reducing the chances of trade wars.
Right, we talked about that a little earlier. Can you remind our listener what multilateral trade agreements are and how they work?
Sure. Multilateral trade agreements are basically agreements between three or more countries that set rules and regulations for trade between them.
Okay.
The goal is to create a level playing field, reduce barriers to trade, and encourage economic cooperation.
So instead of countries going it alone and trying to protect their own industries at the expense of others, they're working together to create a system that benefits everyone.
Exactly. Of course, these agreements can be really complicated and take a long time to negotiate, but they can be incredibly powerful tools for promoting global stability and prosperity.
Yeah, it sounds like these agreements could be a key part of the solution, but they're not a magic bullet.
Definitely not. They're just one piece of the puzzle. And it's important to remember that even the best designed agreements only work if the countries involved are actually committed to upholding their end of the bargain.
That's true. So we've got diplomacy and multilateral trade agreements as potential tools for de-escalating trade wars and reducing the risk of conflict. Are there any other approaches that might be worth exploring?
Yeah, one source suggested that targeted sanctions might be a more effective way to deal with specific concerns without necessarily triggering a full-blown trade war.
Right, we talked about that earlier too, but it's worth revisiting. Can you remind our listener what targeted sanctions are and how they're different from those broader tariffs?
Sure. Targeted sanctions are economic or financial penalties imposed on specific individuals, organizations, or countries that are engaging in harmful or illegal activities.
Okay, so instead of punishing an entire country with tariffs,
Yeah.
you focus on the specific actors who are actually causing the problems.
Exactly. The idea is to apply pressure where it's needed most without causing unnecessary economic damage or making tensions worse.
It sounds like a more surgical approach, like addressing the root of the problem without causing all that collateral damage.
That's a good way to put it. Of course, targeted sanctions have their own challenges.
Right.
They can be tough to implement effectively, and there's always the risk of unintended consequences.
But it seems like they could be a valuable tool in the right circumstances.
Yeah.
A way to address specific concerns without resorting to, the blunt instrument of a trade war.
I agree. And it's worth noting that targeted sanctions are often used along with diplomacy as part of a bigger strategy to change behavior or resolve disputes.
So it's not an either situation.
Right.
It's about using a variety of tools and approaches in a coordinated and strategic way.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that question we posed earlier. What responsibility do countries have to think about how their economic policies affect global security?
It's a question that goes way beyond just tariffs and trade wars.
It does.
It's about understanding that the global economy is all interconnected and that actions taken in one part of the world can have huge consequences elsewhere.
You're absolutely right. And it's about recognizing that economic security is tied to national security and global stability.
So as we continue this deep dive, we need to keep this broader context in mind.
We do. And we need to consider not just the economic impacts of trade wars, but also how they can undermine diplomatic efforts, increase tensions, and make conflict more likely.
It's a complex and challenging issue, but one that we can't afford to ignore.
I couldn't agree more. The stakes are just too high.
So where do we go from here? We've laid out the potential dangers of trade wars, looked at those psychological factors that can contribute to conflict escalation, and examined the U.S.-China trade war as an example of how economic competition can quickly turn into a bigger geopolitical rivalry.
We've also talked about some potential solutions.
Right, like diplomacy, multilateral trade agreements, and targeted sanctions.
And we've emphasized how important it is to consider the bigger geopolitical context and how interconnected the global economy is when making economic policy decisions.
So what's next for our listener?
Well, I think the next step is to dig into the specific case studies that were mentioned in the sources you provided.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. By looking at real-world examples of how trade wars have played out in the past and how they're happening now,
Right.
we can get a better understanding of how complex they are and the potential consequences of different policy choices.
So let's dive into some of these case studies and see what we can learn.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so we've covered some pretty heavy stuff in this deep dive, from like how tariffs actually work to all the psychological things that can make conflicts worse. We even talked about the unthinkable, you know, global thermonuclear tension. And honestly, it's been a little, well, unsettling.
It is a lot to take in, but I think it's important to remember that we're not just here to dwell on the problems. We also want to find solutions,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Because what's the point of understanding all this complex stuff if we don't at least try to make things better?
That's the right attitude.
Hmm.
So let's switch gears a little bit and dive into some of those potential solutions.
Okay, so we've already talked about those more traditional approaches like diplomacy, multilateral trade agreements, and targeted sanctions.
Hmm.
Is there anything else, any other tools we can use that we haven't considered yet?
One of the sources actually had a really interesting idea, using technology to promote peace and cooperation.
Really?
Yeah. Might sound kind of counterintuitive, especially since we've been talking about how technology can sometimes make conflicts worse.
Yeah.
But hear me out.
Okay, I'm listening. How could technology help us create peace?
Well, imagine if we could use artificial intelligence, AI, to help us understand, like, the root causes of conflict.
Hmm.
AI could look at tons of data, identify patterns, and maybe even predict potential flashpoints before they blow up. Kind of like an early warning system for global instability.
Wow, that would be amazing. So instead of reacting to crises after they happen, we could actually be proactive and prevent them.
Exactly. And that's just one example. We could also use something like blockchain technology to create a system of global governance that's more transparent and accountable.
Okay.
Imagine if international agreements were all recorded on a ledger that can't be changed. It'd be way harder for countries to, cheat or back out of their commitments.
That would be huge for international cooperation. If everyone trusted the system more, it'd be much easier to work together on those shared challenges.
Exactly. And these are just a couple of ways we could use technology for good. I think there's a lot of potential there that we need to explore.
I totally agree. It feels like we're at a crossroads, right? We can either let technology lead us towards conflict and destruction, or we can use it to build a more peaceful and just world.
It's a choice we all have to make, both as individuals and as a global community.
So as we wrap up this step dive, I think it's really important to emphasize that even though these challenges are huge and complicated, they're not impossible to overcome. We have the tools, the knowledge, and the ingenuity to build a better future.
Yeah. It all comes down to making the right choices and working together to achieve our shared goals.
And that brings us back to that question we asked earlier, what responsibility do countries have to think about how their economic policies affect global security?
It's a question that goes way beyond just tariffs and trade wars. It's about understanding that we're all connected
Yeah.
and that our actions have consequences for everyone else.
So as we move forward, we need to start seeing the world in a more holistic way, right? Like everything is connected.
Exactly. We need to think beyond just our own self-interest and consider the well-being of humanity as a whole.
I like that. And to our listener out there, I want to leave you with this thought. The future isn't set in stone. It's something we create through our choices and our actions.
So let's choose wisely and work together to build a world where peace and prosperity win out.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something and maybe even had a few thought-provoking moments along the way.
Until next time, stay curious,